We've seen a resurgence of real toxic hatred and intolerance to refugees and immigrants. We've seen, an increasing hatred for gay, lesbian, and transgender people, and we've seen really the rise of regimes that are really disrespectful of large numbers of their citizens. We have corporals and inspectors who are essentially imposing death sentences without investigation, without prosecution, without a judgment. They are the executor. Our responsibility now is basically three things. The first is that we have to understand the constitutional provisions, and the second is we have to struggle for them. We have to defend them. Half of the country is actually very happy with the constitution as it is currently.
As part of our continuing series with the elephant, we now have a great interview to wind up the year, especially in light of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights celebrating 70 years. And we have with us today Irungu Houghton, the Executive Director of Amnesty International, Kenya, to talk us through where we are. And that's a perfect place to start. Where are we in Kenya with respect to human rights?
It's 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted. And it was adopted in Paris, France. 58 member nations, then member nations of the United Nations, were present. 48 voted for the adoption. There were two African countries, Ethiopia and South Africa. Ethiopia voted for the adoption of the Universal Declaration. South Africa declined, and then proceeded to roll out probably the most fascist racial regime that this world has ever seen, called apartheid.
Apartheid. This was just about the same time that apartheid was being,
Actually, the same year.
The same year, exactly 1948, right?
Yeah. So they went in the opposite direction completely.
Yeah.
And I think, 70 years on, we're present to a number of things. First of all, that the need for the Universal Declaration is probably never been greatest. We've seen a resurgence of real toxic hatred and intolerance to refugees and immigrants. We've seen, an increasing hatred for gay, lesbian, and transgender people, and we've seen really the rise of regimes that are really disrespectful of large numbers of their citizens. And it's not just in the north, it's not just in Europe and the United States of America, but also in places like Brazil, in Turkey, and in places like India. So I think, the 26 articles in the Universal Declaration have really, have really got relevance in this context right now.
Yeah, and given that perhaps the focal point of this rolling back in terms of human rights has been the West.
Right.
Looking at Africa through the lens of its own relationship with the West, which many times has been seen as a donor sort of recipient relationship. How does that sort of carry through to the kind of things that we're seeing here? And are there lines that we can draw, are there parallels that we're drawing because of the regression from defense of human rights in the States and elsewhere?
So we start from our own perspective. Human rights was also not popular in 1948. When Dedan Kimathi and the Kenya Land and Freedom Army and all the patriots that took up arms, or they went to the streets, or they organized, their call was basically a human rights call, and they were calling for the right to vote, the right to have a voice, and a right to, property, and to be able to move freely within this country. And it is really ironic that actually the British government, who then signed and adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, proceeded for the next 10 years to deny every single one of those rights to Kenyans. Something like, I think they say, between 1952 and 1956, those 4 years, the British government executed a man or a woman every day for those 4 years. So it made the liberation movement really have to turn to nowhere but itself to be able to organize. And I think this has been the lesson for me in terms of human rights work, that if human rights is not domesticated, if it's not owned by the population, not human rights NGOs, not even human rights council or lawyers, but if it's not owned by people, then actually we'll go nowhere. And I think there are lessons also as we turn this particular year, that the idea that human rights will happen in Africa because the West say so, or the West, Europe or America say so, that is gone a long time, and good riddance to it. I think what I would really look for is less conditionality from the North or European countries, but really a sense that actually we are holding our governments accountable from bottom up.
And that brings to the fore a very interesting debate, and it's the debate that's been happening for a long, long time, because human rights have been perceived to be a Western concept, right? We have no ownership. We have no understanding of what it means, and yet we ask for them, we demand them every day. How do you feel that the concept of human rights is being understood locally?
So if I look at the way that the human rights, I guess human rights law has evolved over the years, and it should be noted actually the first time that a international instrument talked about the rule of law was actually the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So before that, there was no concept of rule of law as a legal concept. What's happened over the years, I think, is that we started off looking at social and what they call civil and political rights. This is the right to life, the right to vote, the right to speech, the right to assembly. And then more recently, in the last 20 years, there's been a real recognition that actually the right to food, the right to education, health, that these are as important as the other rights. And I think part of this was to do with the fact that these second set of rights were basically dealt with by welfare states in Europe and America. But in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, these were the rights that actually affected millions of people. And I think what's exciting now is that actually we don't have to choose between these two sets of rights. We also don't have to choose between Western and African thoughts. In fact, I often say that, if you think in a binary, by definition, you're not thinking very wisely, right? We tend to do good, bad, black, white, gay, straight. So it's either or. The world is much more complicated than that. And I think, in 2018, what I'm present to is a number of things. First of all, let's drop the legalism around human rights. They are fundamental and inalienable is the language. They cannot be taken away from us, whether the law changes or not. The second thing we can drop is this idea that somehow, northern countries have the responsibility of imposing on southern countries a set of legal frameworks. And I think if you get rid of those two things, then all you're left with really is citizens and people's power. And people's power is not simply people outside of the state. It is also progressive duty bearers or state officials who recognize that their ultimate role is to keep their citizens away from just two things, really, just two things: freedom from want of anything, and freedom of fear. If they can just deal with those two, the countries that we see across this continent will be able to actually move to the next level. And the progress that we're seeing economically, or the growth that we're seeing economically, that would be shared.
Now, you raise such interesting touch points for me to go into. I'm almost at a loss as to which one to follow, but I'll follow this one first, because that's the last thing you mentioned. There is this debate that for Africa at large, to be able to progressively have its citizens enjoy these rights, which are inalienable, you have to seek the kingdom of economic freedom first, right? To you, does that wash as an argument that should work, or does work, or can work in a country like Kenya, in a continent like Africa?
So that phrase was first, I think, introduced, at least in the African continent, by Kwame Nkrumah in, I think it was 1956 or 58. And actually, ironically, this week is the celebration of the All Africa People's Conference, 1958. And I think Amnesty, we draw inspiration from both. The declaration and the resolutions that came out of our forefathers and our foremothers back in 1958. No, it doesn't wash. Even when Kwame Nkrumah said it, he has been quoted out of context, because Kwame Nkrumah, one of the things that he's remembered for is the infrastructural development that took place to make sure that energy and electricity would be serviced by hydroelectric dams. He was a big economic thinker. So even if you quote him out of context, the one thing we recognize is actually he did both, politics and the economics. I think for Kenya, what we have to think a little bit about is how do you create an economic model that actually suits the constitutional aspiration that we have. So if, for example, you are losing 30% of your budget to corruption and mismanagement of public resources, yet you say that you have a chapter called Chapter 6 that's about legal integrity, then those two things are completely
at loggerheads.
Exactly. I think the other thing is, if we look at prudent debt management, we are probably spending about 45% of the national budget simply paying back donors and lenders for projects that many times we don't even have access as the public to the documents that essentially were negotiated with those. And I'm thinking particularly in terms of the Chinese government relations with Kenya at the moment, and in specifically the SGR project. You know, so I think, you know, politics and economics are two sides of the same coin. We have to prosecute them both, and funny enough, human rights is about both.
But maybe we can even go a step further and talk about the thinking, the structural thinking about our economics in this country. Often quoted sessional paper 10 of 65, and the thinking that came from it afterwards seems to have been transposed to today, or inherited today. How do you create a shift? Right, so we have this constitution with all of our aspirations lined up in it. But how do you create that shift, that actual shift, where businesses start to think about the implications of the investments that they make as a factor to which that can enable a person's, you know, economic and political and social freedom, as opposed to pursuing a profit motive? How do you start to inspire that thinking at that level, and perhaps also inspire it at the level where people who would benefit from these rights can actually start to demand them?
So I think, you know, it actually reminds me of a conversation we had about 4 months ago. So we organized a dinner, and we invited some of the biggest transnational corporations based in Kenya, about 15 of them, to come into a room and have a conversation with us about what's the relationship between business and human rights. And after a 3-hour conversation, essentially first of all, it continued for 3 hours. So that's the first thing. We didn't finish in the first 15 minutes, right? And realized there's nothing in common. After 3 hours of a conversation, what we realized was actually it's people. So the perspective from the business community is, if you do not have ethical, empowered, and responsible citizens, then your business profits will continue to be eaten into by unethical behavior, kitu kidogo, and petty crime. From our side, as Amnesty and for human rights organizations more broadly, I think what we've realized is that if you do not have an economy that is producing surplus, you do not have the resources to be able to put into education, health, and microfinance, or in small and medium enterprise projects. You can't support jobs without a public works program. So these things are not opposed in our view. What is, I think, opposed to both of those agendas is really the greed that we've seen that proceeds to give state officers the confidence that they can go to office on our behalf, whether they're elected or appointed, and essentially do business with the state. And I think that's where the Degwa Commission got it wrong. I think the African Socialism paper probably is so far in the past that we don't need to go there. But I think the one for me that's critical is the Constitution. And there are two sides of the Constitution. There are freedoms and rights that do not require funding. So it does not cost the Ministry of Finance any money for the police to stop killing young men in places like Dandora, Mathare, and Kisauni. It doesn't require funding, right? It doesn't require funding for people to respond to emergency healthcare, right? With the speed that it's required, what the paramedics call the golden hour. So there are rights that we can actually protect and advance without funding. But there is also rights that do require funding. And I think for me, the focus on housing, the right to housing and the right to health within the Jubilee Manifesto needs to be the focus. And if they cannot do anything else, but simply just deliver on those two in terms of rights, those would be the ones that we would probably be very happy about.
Yeah, but you see, it might not require funding to ask the police to stop killing, young men. It might not require funding to be able to respond to emergencies, but what it does require is a change, a complete shift in thinking. Who inspires that?
Right.
Who inspires that thinking, and where does that come from? Right. What creates that unction, I guess, is what I'm asking.
That's a great question. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. One is, every generation has its responsibilities. Now, if we think about it, the generation of the Pio Pintos, the Bildad Kagias, the Mzee Odinga, all they had their responsibility, and everything that they struggled for has now found its way into the Constitution. That was their responsibility. It took, in some cases, 50 years for that to happen.
So what's our responsibility?
Our responsibility now is basically three things. The first is that we have to understand the constitutional provisions, and the second is we have to struggle for them. We have to defend them. We did an opinion poll just recently, and what was really interesting from the opinion poll is to learn that, first of all, that half of the country is actually very happy with the constitution as it is currently. So while the political class continue to tell us that it's a flawed constitution, the reality is that most Kenyans are very happy with the constitution as it is.
Yeah.
The second thing that the poll told us was that 1 in 2 Kenyans have actually protected their own human rights in the last 6 months, and they see that as a protection of human rights. And 1 in 3 have actually protected the rights of their neighbors, right, or the people near them. So I think for me the question is how do you get a citizenry that is alert, it's ready to report, and it has the confidence and the resilience that if it follows up on a human rights violation, it will not tire until the perpetrator is arrested and some action is taken. And I think that's the first thing. So getting people to do this, and I think that for us as Amnesty is our major focus.
Yeah.
And it means going beyond the NGO model, because we can't put t-shirts on everybody and we can't pay allowances to everybody. So I think we should just stop doing those two things and actually just start saying to people, wherever you are, whatever you're concerned about, if it is a human rights violation, we have the resources and the support to give you to be able to take action, and you don't have to wear our t-shirt.
But you see, that's another thing that you're up against, because it's not, you see, the t-shirt wearing, the allowance giving, and this is not to excuse that kind of behavior, because it is creating some sort of need that shouldn't exist. But it's a smaller cog in the bigger wheel of neoliberal thought, right? And essentially, that's what we're talking about, even as we talk about the Ndegwa Commission, as we go further back to 65, it's that kind of neoliberal capitalist, and capitalist in this means, I'm talking specifically about neoliberalism, that encourages that kind of rent-seeking behavior in a sense, in every industry, right, in every subsector. If we've been dealing with this and living with this for 30 years, there are some people who don't even know another way. Who's to show them? Who's to show them that way?
So I think every day there are examples of people standing up against the system. And I think the biggest consequence of the system is not even the transactionalism that you see in our society.
Yeah.
It is really the sense that that people can never do anything for free, and this idea that nothing will ever change. These two concepts are probably the most, the most dangerous concepts that we have in our country today.
Are they lies, though?
They are completely created. They are fabricated, made up in order to keep people in a state of consciousness that will not demand their rights, will not come forward and demand how their taxes are being spent, and furthermore will not challenge those who we sent to public office to do the right thing. And I think it's completely set up that way. So I guess your question is what would tip that in the different direction? And, over the years, I've interacted with lots of teachers and head teachers. And on the issue of land grabbing, one of the things that's always surprised me is the extent to which teachers with a salary of maybe 50 to 60,000 shillings per month continue to whistleblow and continue to protect schools in cases where the land is probably in the value of 2 to 5 million shillings, right? And I keep asking, these people, not unlike our parliamentarians, they're not asking for car loans, for extra health insurance for their second wives and various other goodies. These people are actually just taking action because they see that if they stand aside and allow the land to go, our children and the generations of children to come will not have school playgrounds. They will essentially just have classrooms, and then they will go home. So I think for me that's the first example. 3 weeks ago I was in a committee, maximum prison, and I met with a class of prisoners who are basically on life sentences. Many of them started off as death row prisoners. I met a young man called, actually no, he's not a young man anymore. He came in at 19. He's now 41. This is Wilson Kinyua. Now,
he's lived his entire life.
And we were sitting there, and it's a law class, and they're all graduating fairly soon with law degrees. And I asked them, how many of you here in this room ever thought that you would study law? No hands went up. How many of you thought that one day you would be in prison studying law? And none of their hands went up. Yet these people will all graduate in the next year or two. One of them, Wilson, has actually not only gone through the study, but he's actually represented 12 other inmates and he was behind the case that struck down the idea that there should be mandatory sentencing of death penalty for the death penalty for anybody who committed a maximum, murder or robbery with violence. So these are the people that I draw strength from. And the problem is we spend too much time talking about the corrupt, the people who operate with impunity. We don't spend enough time talking about these individual cases. And I could go on, I could give you 15 of these people that I've met in the last 6 months, many of whom, are not working for NGOs. They're not working for government. They are simply just decent human beings that recognize their place in history is to leave the country better than they found it.
Yeah. It's an interesting point that you raise that I want to take into another direction, if you will, just slightly, because the narrative around where we are is perhaps not shaped but fueled by the kind of reporting that you see in our mainstream media, and perhaps even seeping into the cynicism, the public cynicism that's growing about whether things can or will not change. So from where you sit as Executive Director of Amnesty Kenya, what then is the role of the media, right? Far be it from you to preach, but I'm sure you have some ideas about how then this kind of thinking and these kinds of examples can percolate at the same time as us shining a light on what exactly is going on that's wrong. Yeah, so what's your idea?
So the media is fundamental to a democratic state and a informed society. In March, I dropped everything and just rushed to the Nation Media House when I learned that there was an attempt to try and arrest 3 very senior journalists. And that was the beginning of essentially the blackout that we had for that 1 week. And I was very clear that regardless of whether people were watching the news or not, regardless of whether people watch television or not, or rather, let me put it this way, Kenyan television stations, because it seems like we're all, as soon as people have a certain amount of disposable cash, they're going to Netflix and to DSTV and other places. But I was very clear that if we didn't protect the media, something very fundamental would have happened to the society. There is a phrase that they use in Germany, that they used in Germany, that said, they didn't come for they came for the Jew, but I didn't stand up because I wasn't a Jew. They then came for I think the word they used was the homosexual. I didn't stand up for the homosexual because I wasn't one. They came for the trade union. I didn't stand up, and then they came for me, and there was no one else. Now, the role of the media makes that comment a little more serious. And it goes like this. It's a very short adaptation of that one. They came for the journalist, and then I never knew what was happening. So journalists are fundamental.
Yeah.
Their role is just 2. One is educate us, inform us, and then secondly, give us a sense of purpose. That actually these big issues that we see around us, that we are connected to them in ways in which we have a responsibility to pronounce ourselves, to take action. And I think that's, for me, the role of the media, and investigative, educational. I think the other thing that we probably need to be clear about is that we are living in a very interesting time, particularly with fake news and toxicity of lies and falsehoods.
Yeah.
And I think the media needs to do 2 things. One is safeguard itself from fake news, and then secondly, safeguard itself from the rent-seeking or the corrupt practices of essentially politicians or even citizens buying news stories.
Do you think the media is living up to those aspirations?
I am disappointed with the media in many cases. We do see a lot of cases where you just want the media to just tell it as it is. Don't say a prominent politician, name the politician. But we have to understand the context in which they're working. 2 things. If it is not corruption, and if it is not, I guess what you'd say, patronage, that they have somehow been bought out, or they are essentially doing the work of their owners. The third thing really is that the penalties for journalism in terms of investigative stories are very high, right? So there is a fear that you will be smashed with slander, with all the defamation cases that will come. And I think that's the context in which our media works. So I would like to slam all the media, but I have too many friends who are courageous and who are clear that their role is actually to inform the country and government on everything that is going wrong and everything that's going right.
Okay, let's go back for a moment to the opinion poll that Amnesty Kenya did, and The outcome of that, or some of the outcomes of that are very interesting. Some not surprising. For instance, number one, with a bullet, no pun intended or pun intended, are the police as being the worst, sort of like, with respect to human rights. But what for you was surprising from this opinion poll?
So I think for me, first of all, that Kenyans still believe in the Constitution. I expected, given the lack of real enforcement and for example, you take the National Action Plan on Human Rights that was developed by the Kenya National Commission for Human Rights last year. It's still sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's not being worked on. So my fear was that many citizens would have become despondent and disillusioned with the Constitution because they don't see the change that they voted for back in 2010. So that was a good finding in some ways. I think the second finding for me was with regards to kind of police brutality and extrajudicial killings. I do think that there is a real missed opportunity of the government to actually deliver on the police reforms that were announced back in August. So we had a very clear steer from the president that command and control would be vested in the commanding officers of the police stations and that they would be held accountable. That has not happened. In the last 3 weeks, we've seen 30 young people. And just to make this clear, because I know the police service sometimes feel that Amnesty just focuses on, I guess, citizens who are killed by police officers. We are deeply concerned about the unlawful use of force and discharge of firearms by police officers of other police officers. We are really concerned about citizens who fail or who refuse to obey the authority of a uniformed officer. So it is the general lawlessness that we are concerned about. And we hold police officers to a higher level because in many ways they are actually there to uphold the rule of law.
Yeah, they are the standard bearers of the law. Yeah.
And one of the most sad things, I think, was, was watching the level of trust, which is very low in the police force as a result of the killings. But at the same time, seeing a very high percentage of Kenyans saying that is who they have to go to. So many Kenyans don't trust the police enough. They fear them, but yet they have to go and report cases to them. And I think this is where a sense of urgency needs to be brought as a result of this study.
Would you report a case of abuse if someone came and abused you, yes, or a member of your family, committed a crime against your family? Would the first port of call be your local police station?
Yes.
And why?
Because I have worked hard to develop a understanding of the law, and I recognize that actually that is the place where justice starts. Now, whether it happens or not is another question, but I would start there and I would work at that system until I get the outcome that I will require. My main concern essentially has been that the criminal justice system, because it is a system, you have a police officer you report to, that police officer has to file a report. Yeah. That then goes to it may go to the Director of Public Prosecutions. They have to file a case in court. The judge has to listen. The evidence has to be brought. So there is a cycle there. And I think what's wrong with the rule of law and the criminal justice system is not just at the level of the police. It is also at the level, at those other levels that I've raised. So I actually continue to argue that people need to push the police to do their work properly, yeah, and to make sure that there are convictions. We have no other option. There are other options. People, have reverted to mob violence, for example. But that is a system that actually is not founded in any law and is extremely dangerous because the levels of violence just increase. Yeah. And then we do not get justice at the end of the day. Yeah.
The question that I was asking, I wanted to lead up to something else.
Sure.
Is that Irungu Houghton, as the executive director of Amnesty International Kenya, has some perceived sort of either pull in society or access to money, to finances, right, that could ensure, I'm not saying that it would ensure in your case, but could ensure that the wheels of justice turn a bit faster, right? In your case. I want us to talk about those reflections with respect to the opinion poll, yeah, that you carried out.
One of the interesting things, John, was a recognition that while something like 50% of the population feel, yeah, that as a result of their class or their income, or corruption, they will not get justice from, I presume, either from the judiciary or the police force or any other state office. And I think that is a very worrying statistic for me. Now, obviously, if I was looking for justice for a member of my family or even for a member of staff, I would not bring either my income or the weight of Amnesty to bear on that process. Yeah. But I think what's really important for me is that until we have a system where, regardless of your class, your ethnicity, or your sexual preference, the law is applied equally to all of us, then nobody is safe. And this is the question that I've asked very senior government officers. Do you have T-shirts for all of your children, your relatives, that says, I am the son of the cabinet secretary, don't shoot me? Because if you don't, then by turning your eye to what's happening in our urban settlements in Mombasa particularly and Nairobi, you are actually creating the conditions that one day, heaven forbid, your child will also be a casualty. And that casualty will pass like a statistic. So we have to create the conditions that everybody is safe, regardless. And it's a basic principle of human rights, which is that you don't have different rights for different classes. In fact, part of what I think is wrong in this country is that we have this concept that power and privilege give people more status in society rather than simply the same status as everybody else.
Or perhaps that word that's now being bastardized with respect to human rights is that some are gained progressively. So I understand that there is some sort of implication, as we've spoken about, in terms of financing of certain human rights for them to be enacted. But it almost seems as if the government many times rests in that position where they can pick and choose. And I'll give you an example. In 2015, when President Obama visited the country, they held a joint press conference with President Kenyatta. And President Kenyatta was asked very directly about gay rights. Right. And the protection of gay rights. And he's like, that's not a priority for us. Do you see that in the same way as he does, that, those kinds of socio-economic rights, social and civic rights, and political rights are not really a priority in a country where we have urban poverty and urban hunger, or something that's more direct as extrajudicial killings?
Binary thinking is not wise. Right? Once you get into this like either or comparison conversation, it's not going to work. Let me just break that down for us. Gay people have safety issues. They have food security issues. They have income issues.
They have health issues.
They have health issues. So this idea that a gay person is somehow a different person from the rest of Kenyans is probably where the problem starts. So let me ask the question, it is now what? How many years? It's 55 years since independence. We are still holding on to colonial laws that give police officers the right to search the anuses of Kenyans to find out whether they are gay or not. That's as crude as it is. We have laws on our statute books that continue to criminalize two people of the same sex who want to have a relationship and love each other. We can even award 14 years jail sentence for that. My question is, what humane society would retain these kind of laws? And why are we getting into the bedroom and into the lives of people who are making choices powerfully for themselves, who they want to love and who they want to live with? And I think the key thing for me is if you're a gay person, that conversation about whether it's a non-issue or an issue is a very real conversation for you. It is an issue. If you are a heterosexual person who does not, who cannot think beyond the binary of man, woman, I can see how this could be a non-issue for you. There's a statistic that was generated by Afrobarometer. 89% of Kenyans, gay Kenyans, basically live stigmatized. They risk the possibility of losing their jobs. They may be removed from their homes by landlords that don't understand them. That's 89% of the gay community. And my question is, what is it that we fear so much? What is it that we want to hold on to so much that we can create such an invisibilized minority that have no rights in our society?
First answer would be Kenya is a nation both of laws but of religion, that we are either Christian or we are Muslim. What do you make of religiosity in these kinds of debates, and how does it help or does it hurt these kinds of debates?
There's a great conversation I had once with Eric Gitari, who talked about what it took for his grandmother to appreciate all of him.
This is Eric Gitari, the gay human,
the human rights activist.
Human rights activist.
Yeah, actually the founder of the commission, the Lesbian and Gay Human Rights Commission. Yeah. And she took him way back to, when she was a child, and the two men who were the faith healers or the doctors in their community who were gay. So the idea that somehow this has come across with Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's is completely absurd. It is as part of our society as every other part of the society, good or bad. The second point is that the binary idea that somehow gay and lesbian and transgender choices are non-religious is another confusion in itself. Most of the gay people that I know are Christians, right? They go to church. In fact, one of the things that they often push for is for recognition that they too can have access to the scripture, that they too can be blessed, that they too can work and live according to the the religious faith that they have chosen. And I think this is increasingly becoming understood globally. And I suspect over the next 5 to 10 years, what you're going to begin to see is more and more pastors recognizing that actually their role is to minister to all people, regardless of their choices.
Well, the Pope has already made himself
starting with the Pope.
Clear on that. I want to return as a final sort of set of comments from you to the issue of extrajudicial killings. And perhaps also just borrowing from this debate on homosexuality and its legality or the priorities in that society. I find a very interesting, perhaps even confusing debate to follow. So on the one hand, you have this set of people who are day in, day out, hearing gunshots, right? Knowing friends, relatives who are gunned down in many parts of Kenya, and perhaps specifically or acutely in Nairobi and Mombasa. But then you go online and you go to the Facebook pages of HESI and these perceived police officers who post their killings as sort of trophies. And the comment section there is most interesting. 80%, just as an anecdote, but a majority of them would be in favor of these kinds of killings. How do you reconcile yourself to that, where you are on the one hand defending the rights of people who perhaps are not, many times or sometimes these people actually are criminals, right? But on the other hand, you are defending these rights in the face of such open support for these kinds of methods. How do you reconcile yourself with that as Irungu and perhaps as the head of Amnesty International Kenya?
So extrajudicial killings are condemned globally. There is an increasing number of states that are reverting to it, and they are getting support from either specific communities or large numbers of the public. But I think we have to look at it in context. The first context is that, for people who are frightened and are threatened by violent criminals or do not have any faith in the criminal justice system, this is a default position, right? Which is we don't trust that this system will actually convict these people, and we are frightened, right? So the first thing we have to recognize is that extrajudicial killings is probably the most serious indictment of our law enforcement agencies. They are failing to protect people to a point that they are trusted with the enforcement of the law. The second point, I think, is, and we found this interesting in the study. So it is often said, that communities are very happy, and we've seen even cases where, if you remember the famous case of Administrative Police Constable Ombecha here in Parklands, who basically had to declare that he was not going to shoot the two suspects while there was a crowd baying for their blood. It's often said that communities are calling for this, but actually the study that we've just done shows that 69% of the population actually have a fear that police brutality, extrajudicial killings, and police harassment is probably their highest risk as Kenyans. So it's not the case that actually we're getting any safer as a result of the violent policing. So therefore the question is, if that's not the solution, what is the solution? The solution is essentially the police force service, and you see how we're slipping back into the other language because of the reality of the day. The police force, the police service need to be able to, first of all, prosecute cases in a manner in which they are legally entitled to do so. So one of the things that I often say to police officers is you can, I say you can because you have the power of a weapon. You can execute somebody, that's easy. But the law is not on your side. The law is actually on the side of you disarming that person, taking them to court, and then let the process proceed from there. And if it's not working, why are we not hearing from the Inspector General and the leadership of the police service a demand of the judicial process that the caseload or the cases be dealt with in a much more efficient and professional manner? We don't hear that. And then we're left with a situation where we've had 2 successive presidents commute something like 6,000 death sentences. But we have corporals and inspectors who are essentially imposing death sentences without investigation, without prosecution, without a judgment. They are the executor. In fact, if anything, they have just absorbed 4 levels of our criminal justice system. And the concern that we have as Amnesty is that it's extremely dangerous, because once you have that process, it can be used for contract killings. It can be used for political battles between politicians. But the thing we've seen is that actually the police officers become part of the criminality that we've seen in these places.
But one has to ask, though, is that any different from how the police force was actually designed in the colonial state? Are we seeing just perhaps a more refined, a 2.0 version of what was designed by the colonial state to subjugate Africans by any means necessary? I mean, you're the one who gave the statistic about a Kenyan being killed every day.
Yeah, for 4 years.
For 4 years. So are we seeing anything different? And should the language be reform or complete just, overhaul?
I mean, the language that's actually used by the Cabinet Secretary is radical reform. My sense is that to answer your question, I guess, no, the police service has changed dramatically since 1948. So that's clear. And the studies, I think, reflect that, although we didn't ask them that specific question. We have a number of laws, we have a number of processes, we have a number of oversight institutions like the IPOAs and the Internal Affairs Unit and organizations, human rights organizations. They weren't there in 1948. So we have this process. Citizens are also much more aware of their rights than they were previously. But does that mean that people are safer in these places? Not yet. And I think that's where we need to put the emphasis. And I think there are kind of like 3 things that are required. First of all is human rights training for police officers. Secondly is, I think we need to look at technology, and at some point I think we're going to have to put body cameras on every single police officer that are operating these areas, because we can't trust them to uphold the law.
Yeah.
And the third thing is we need to hold commanding officers in the different stations completely accountable for the discharge of firearms, and secondly, the cases where there's been a loss of life. Unfortunately, at the moment, what seems to happen is a firearm is discharged, the officer goes back, makes a report, takes off their uniform, goes home, sleeps, comes back the next day, is given another firearm, and continues to take the beat. There are no serious investigations or inquiries that are being done. I have it that from IPOA that they have yet to receive reports, direct reports from the police in the case of the 20 or so young men that have been killed in the last 3 weeks, regardless of whether they're criminals or not. Their families are owed an explanation for why their lives were taken. And the law actually states, I mean, the IPOA Act is very clear that if a firearm is discharged, if there is a loss of life, a report is immediately sent to the Independent Policing and Oversight Authority. In the absence of that, there's just lawlessness.
Does it discourage you that this is still happening?
So I have 2 basic, very secret ways that I keep myself from going cynical.
Yeah.
One is that my feelings are not emotions; they are essentially choices. Any activist, any leader that works with a sense of cynicism immediately loses the status of an activist or a transformer or a leader. So the first thing is to continue to keep ahead of everything the hope that one day Kenyans will be safe, they will be dignified, and they will be respected without discrimination. And that's how I continue to do my work. And that's a choice. If I have to make it every morning, and almost like you get out of bed and you say, today I am going to work and make sure that this happens.
Yeah.
I will do that for the rest of my life. The other thing I do is I time my disappointments. So if, every time I see a body on the streets of Nairobi with, 6 bullet wounds or blood, all over the photo, I take a moment to just mourn the death that has passed and then regain my resolve. Because I think if you don't do that, it is possible for you to become part of the problem, which is to remain comatose, cynical, and just keep your head down, hoping that one day this doesn't show up on your doorstep.
All right. Here's to seeing the next celebration of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with us being better, but not as unequal as it was phrased in your opinion, Paul. Irungu Houghton, thank you very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure.